His recent memoir, Sy portrays his outsider status at the New York Times and the New Yorker. Maintaining independence required him to publish offshore. Confronting official narratives, he reveals in his memoirs stories behind the stories as he chases the leads, cultivates sources, and grapples with the weight of what he uncovers. Sy HERSH, predictably, who else but Sy to break the Norseman's story? We're honored to give Sy a platform which the compromised mainstream media has denied. With his new go-to Substack, Sy leapfrogged the censors at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Economist. After Sy completes his presentation, his talk, our Vice Chairman Bruce Fine, Bruce right here, will opine on whether Sy's narrative establishes Congress's citizens must step into the breach. Our citizenship requires.
I don't want to do a speech because I'll get in trouble if I do, but so I'll do something. We'll just do questions. This is still in the stage where whatever I did is, I think I'll tell you, I was thinking about how to do this without getting into too much trouble. I'm going to read you a couple things. You can draw your own conclusions about what I'm saying about either the first or the second one, and we can go from there it's about journalism in a way, I guess. I don't know. The first thing is my favorite, one of the favorite paragraphs in books that I read in my 800 years of reading. It's from a book called Johnny, We Hardly Know You. It's about Jack Kennedy. It was a memoir that was published in 1976, became a great bestseller. It was about two guys who were, I guess you could call them, they were friends of Jack Kennedy. They were also wingmen. And if you don't know what that means, just think Bill Clinton and Vernon Jordan, then you'll know what I mean. Here's my favorite passage in the book about Jack Kennedy. These are two guys that were insiders that he could always count on. And so this is the section in which Dave Powers is describing a night at the White House with the president. Dave was accustomed to being summoned for night duty at the White House when Jackie was around, or absent rather. He called himself John's other wife. The president hated to be alone in the evening. It was understood that Dave would be available to keep him company. Dave stayed with him until he went to bed. The nightly routine was always the same. The White House kitchen staff would prepare a dinner of broiled chicken or lamb chops that was left in the second floor apartment. That's the Secret Service calls it the mansion. It's quite an apartment. Anyway, be left in the second story apartment on a hot plate appliance, so they could eat late in the evening. He and Dave, the president and Dave, without keeping the kitchen staff waiting to serve him. How very considerate. They then would watch television or sit outside on the Truman balcony, or the president would read a book or smoke a cigar while David drank several bottles of Heineken beers. They joke a little bit, and around 11 o'clock, the president would get undressed, slip into the short-length Brooks Brothers sleeping jacket that he wore in preference to pajamas. They would watch him get into bed. This is astonishing. They would watch him get into bed and say his prayers, and then he would say to David, "Good night, pal. Would you please turn out the light?" And David would say good night to the Secret Service agents on duty in the hallway and drive himself home to McLean. I mean, there you have it. Sort of like classic American journalism about the president. I wrote a book about him in 1989 or 1997, Dark Side, for which I still get letters. So the other thing I'm going to read is from an interview that the New York Times did with one of the three reporters who wrote a story the other week about a yacht that ended up somewhere in Central Europe and deserted with traces of blood and some TNT on a table, and indications that there had been a diver aboard that became sort of the alternative story, at least in the New York Times. So one of the three guys, a guy, I don't know him, Julian Barnes, a guy, I have no idea, he could be, I'm just going to tell you what, he went on radio. They have something called the New York Times, the Daily Podcast, you know what, the Daily? That's apparently very popular. So I didn't hear this, but somebody sent me the transcript. So it's about a couple of days after the story. This is a story that said that it couldn't have been done. It wasn't done by America, but it was done actually, according to the New York Times' reporting, by a group, very possible group that were Ukrainians, Ukrainian dissidents. And of course, Zelensky didn't know, and neither did, of course, anybody in America. But anyway, and so it was a story to that effect that was all over the front page. And so there's a guy named Michael Barbaro, apparently, who narrates this podcast. I haven't listened. I'm not into podcasts, although my children told me I'm crazy not to be, but I'm not. So Julian, says the reporter, this is a couple of days later, it's the morning, I've listened to it, I've heard it, it's on regular radio or something, I don't know. So Julian, who exactly was responsible for this attack? And how did you and your colleagues go about figuring that out? And so the reporter then, chats away. Well, I think what happened was for much of the investigation, we weren't asking exactly the right questions. And so the narrator says, and what were the right questions? Barnes says, well, we logically have been focused on countries. Barbaro says again, And Julian then says, all those states we just went through, did Russia do it? Did the Ukrainian state do it? And that was just hitting a dead end after dead end. We weren't finding officials who were telling us that there was credible evidence pointing at a government. So my colleagues, Adam Aintros, Adam Goldman, and I started asking a different question. Could this have been done by non-state actors? And Barbara said again, a lot of whom's. And could this have been done by a group of individuals who was not working for a government? And Barbara at this point said, kind of like freelance saboteurs. So where did you take this new question? Said Barnes. Well, we started asking who might these saboteurs be? Or if we couldn't answer that, who might they be aligned with? Could they be pro-Russian saboteurs? Could they be other saboteurs? And the more we talked to officials who had access to intelligence, the more we saw this theory gaining traction. Another So Barnes goes on, and my initial thought was that this could be pro-Russian saboteurs my initial thought that this could be pro-Russian saboteurs turned out to be wrong. And we learned that it was most likely a pro-Ukrainian group. Said Barbara, but he asked the question, so in other words, a group of people who did this on behalf of Ukraine. What did you learn that makes you think this is what happened? And Barnes said, Michael, I should be very clear that we know really very little, right? This is what he's saying. I'm just, you take a choice of which one is the most partial, of the two I read. This group remains mysterious, and it remains mysterious not just to us, but also to the US government officials that we have spoken to. That could be my phone. I'm sorry, I didn't turn it off. It goes all the time. How terrible. Just throw it out. Turn it off. Throw it away. I hate it. I do hate it. I hate it like a teenager would hate his mother knowing where he is all the time. Okay, so he says, I should be very clear that we know really very little, right? This group remains mysterious, and it remains mysterious not just to us, but also to the US government officials that we have spoken to. They know that the people involved were either Ukrainian or Russian or a mix. They know that they are not affiliated with the Ukrainian government, but they know they are also anti-Putin and pro-Ukraine. So Barbara now says, so after all this investigative reporting, what you find is that the culprit here is a group of people who want the same thing as Ukraine, but aren't officially tied to the government of Ukraine. I'm curious how certain you are that these individuals are not connected to the Ukrainian government. The reporter goes on, Julian Barnes, again, who I do not know. He says, this is the last line, well, the intelligence right now says they're not. And while officials are telling us that the president of Ukraine and his key advisors did not know, we can't be certain that's true or somebody else did not know. Well, I'm telling you, I don't know. It could have been written by, I guess by Dave Powers. I mean, what? This is the standard? We talk to officials? Not, there you go. So that's what I'm up against on this story. And it doesn't matter that, and every reporter I meet asks me the first question, who are your sources? And why don't you name them? And why don't you do that? And my answer to that, I don't say it publicly. I don't say it to anybody. I don't say it to them. I'll just say it to you. Nobody's gone to jail for talking to me. Nobody's been outed in 50 years. That's why I don't do it. Because and don't think they don't understand in the community. I'm talking about the serious community, not just officials who get to intelligence. So we really have a really scandalous mess here in a funny way, because I don't know what's going on. I worked at the New York Times for 7 or 8 years, and I would say I wrote an awful lot of stories, as you heard, domestic spying and about all Chile and the Allende. And I would say if I wrote 1,000 stories in 8 years, and that's not that many, or 800 stories, I would say that all but about 5 were cited with unnamed sources. How else can you get really good information from people that actually are in intelligence, or actually do have access to intelligence, or might even be players in intelligence? Who knows? And so I don't quite know what's going on. I think this is another bit of the phenomenon, Trump phenomenon, I really do, because we've gone into a situation where if you like Fox News, you don't like CNN and MSNBC, or they're all, you can't get it. I can't imagine an hour's worth of television in which you don't actually learn everything night after night. You learn about there's some guy in Congress that doesn't pay, that's a thief, whatever, a liar. We learn about him for days and hours. We learn everything about whatever's going on with Trump and Jan 6 in both sides, whether you're for it or against it. But we don't ever get news anymore. And the newspapers cover what they want, cover Biden. I think we're the reason I jumped on, I've been doing something else for a couple of years since COVID struck, some other project. One of those, it's sort of interesting to me, but it'll be interesting to nobody else about lying. I've discovered an awful lot that I didn't know about for 50 years about My Lai. You're hard to think you know so much about something. I would say when I wrote my My Lai stuff and won all these prizes, I was at maybe 5% of what really was going on then in the war and what was going on inside the White House and in the government. I'm now getting to 50 and higher, but that's still way below what we need to know about what an institution we can be, even when you're doing an unjust war. And the trick for me is that the people I deal with, and I do have people I deal with that are very interesting and have an awful lot of direct hands-on stuff, not like people who know people or people who are in the government. I do know that we are in a real crisis here with the leadership we have on foreign policy. They have really turned a lot of the world against us. From the day they got in, this is visceral sort of. I went back and looked at anti-communism. I do write for Substack, not because I couldn't publish it anywhere, but because I knew nothing about it. I live my own cocoon, but I'm friendly with a guy named Matt Taibbi. Whether you agree or disagree with him talking to Musk, he's developed on Substack a very interesting, and I will tell you that the basic thesis is that the intelligence community did realize the incredible power they had to manipulate on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter particularly. And there's a lot more to come, and it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant that the government would, in its desperation to prove that that Russia was behind the 2016 election, that Hillary lost. I will tell you right now, I'm not in the business then, but I did look at it, and I do have friends, and I have friends that I've trusted for 40 years. There's not a shred, we can argue it if you want, not a shred of real intelligence. And in fact, our NSA actually warned some people early on, you're getting in real trouble with this. That'll come out one of these days. I don't like to write about NSA stuff, but they were picking up stuff. It's really a mess. That story's a mess. And what the White House, the Obama White House. I gave up on Obama after he lied so much about both the bin Laden raid and other issues. I sort of gave up on him. Not that he didn't do it, but everything else, you know, he's just another guy running for president. I'm sorry. He was better, he was prettier and smarter, but he didn't change the world as he could have, as we thought he might. He didn't change the paradigm. And one of the first things he did, and this story I'm writing tomorrow comes off a long conversation with Richard Obey, who was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee for many, many years, and very powerful man in terms, very discreet and modest, but very important in terms of the intelligence community. He was on a small group that was involved in getting briefed, very small group of people in the House and Senate that actually had access to what they call the findings, what the CIA told them. And it's just very interesting. He had a lot, he quit after one term of Obama because, well, anyway, one of those people that 30 years in Congress, chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, very little publicity, wasn't interested in it, just did his job right, and was an insider and was troubled. And so I don't know where we are. We've got these lunatics. I don't care whether, you know, I'm sure they're high IQ, and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, Newland, I call them Lincoln, Blinken, and Nod, out of those stories that are just doing insane things. The number 2 guy in China ripped us off, just ripped away about 3 or 4 days, and it wasn't much in the paper. China's giving up, you know, we're pushing some buttons that we may not be able to stop. And we have, and we've moved, the whole Chinese move to Saudi Arabia is not just incidental. And the whole move with Iran working with it's just, we're putting ourselves in a real bind, and it's not being reported enough. And the papers aren't critical. They're just too worried about another wacko Republican getting, and as they should be. The bank stuff, you know, Biden can talk all he wants, and he hasn't improved in the last couple of days. He hasn't improved confidence. And he's now up to, they acknowledge $113 billion going into Ukraine. And I'll tell you what and I do talk to people about this. I think what he's going to want, what the real kicker for him, and I'm telling you about stuff I won't write because I'm not that much, I haven't followed it that closely, but I do ask about what Putin, it's very easy. I mean, we're big haters. We learned to hate in the World War II, and we've had, you know, everybody's on our hit list. Saddam, Bashar Assad. We had Gorbachev. We had most of the Russian leaders. Certainly, everybody and all the Khomeini, all the people in Iran are on our hit list. We always have had big hit lists, and of course, and Putin's way up there. But I will tell you, I read his speeches carefully. He doesn't have cancer, all those stories you read about him dying, and he is very smart, and he knows his facts, and he spits them out, and he knows things, and he eats certain things. He allowed the ships to go because he was promised that 30% of them would carry grain to the poor in the world. I remember him saying it. The last statistic he gave out was about 3 months ago, something like 4% of the ships are actually carrying grain to the undeveloped world where they really need it. They're all feeding the money people. I mean, he was even, you know, he wasn't conned on it because he accepted what would happen. And he certainly, you can never get off the schneid for being the first leader to put us in the bloodiest war in Western Europe since World War II. You have to, I guess, Balkans count in there, but it wasn't as bad as what we have now, and certainly Chestnut was nothing like it, although there was a lot of damage. My guess is, like any rational person, he is rational at a certain point. He's going to want to. He doesn't, you know, he's going to want suzerainty is the word I'm hearing. It's the word in the community. He's going to want suzerainty for the Donbass reasons. Crimea is his, you can't take it away. But the big deal is he'll cut a deal with the government, and the deal is demilitarize. And it's going to be a no-go for us. The deal is, I'll cut a deal, I'll stop, You know, he hasn't put his main force in yet, and it's just a question of how many people he can kill. And whether you believe the press or not, I think the coverage of the war has been astonishingly stupid and bad and just awful, because we're not looking at it from any objective way in terms of what really is going on. And the people I talk to are some Europeans, mostly Americans, many have spilled blood in the field in themselves, but went on in the intelligence business, and many are senior. Anyway, the bottom line is, we just may be kidding ourselves about what's going on there and what the result's going to be. And when he wants to call for demilitarization, which I think he will, that's just my guess. That's what there's some readings in the community, that's a way out. I don't know if we'll take it. You know, we've put the 100, you know, we have the 82nd in there in Poland. We've put the 101st in there in Romania. We're talking about brigades. No, we're not talking about battalions. We're talking about brigades. We've had ship after ship in the last couple of weeks loaded with armaments coming in the European ports. It's all designed for sure. I'm sure if the president would ever be asked about it, but then the questions in the White House press conference are just off the wall, not useless. I'm sure that you would hear that there is concern, not about our military leadership, which is as usual. You know, the last one we had with the brain was Dempsey. The other two guys since then are just, you know, sort of what they are, caricatures. And Norm Dempsey, who retired in 2015. And you ought to look at his retirement ceremony. He was an Army general, always interesting to me. He was one of the few given permission after getting out of West Point to get a 2-year graduate degree in fine arts. He studied, he was interested in poetry, basically, and also a fanatic about Irish music. And he went to Duke, got a 2 years master's degree, and then became a combat guy, made a division. But when he retired in August of the 2015, the last day, 4 years as chief, and everybody's there, all the poobahs, even Obama. And at the end, instead of giving the usual fight to the end, he sang an Irish ballad about "It's so sad to see you." And on cue, I don't know how he did it. As a good Catholic, he had a lot of children and a lot of grandchildren. His children let the kids go, and the last scene it's been viewed on YouTube maybe a couple of million times. They all came running and jumped into his arms, which has never happened in a retirement ceremony before for a chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But we all missed that one. And he didn't go on a board. He went back to Duke he had a chair in Duke on ethics and Irish poetry. And so always interesting to me that what the press doesn't cover, something like that, so interesting, so different. And so I don't know where we are. The press is, you know, this kind of coverage that we just heard about is just crazy. It's just crazy. You know, you're talking about you're talking about using C4 undersea to blow up pipelines that are covered by, the pipelines are steel, but they're protected by concrete large barriers surrounding them, because protecting them from the salt water, even though the Baltic Sea isn't nearly as salty as the Atlantic, much less, still is salt water and salinity over years. And so they have to blow up a pipeline, and they have to blow up the concrete first and also get to the pipeline, and they have to do it quickly. And I will tell you the trick of an operation like that. Despite all you read about all these signals and sign, it's few people, very few people, very, very few people. That's how you get away with doing it, very rare. You keep it down to the very minimum. And all these stories I read, I get them every day, guys talking about this ship and that ship. And it's as if nobody understands. You do understand when the president went to, Air Force One went to Poland recently. He flew to Poland on his way to seeing Zelensky. Obama did just a couple of weeks ago. It was I read it either in the Times or the Post, that when the plane got into Polish territory, he turned off his IFF, his transponder, which made him invisible. So then you have all these stories that people who are experts in open source intelligence, called OSINT, you always have them they're very competent. Most of them there's a purpose in them, but they're not seeing anything. They're reading signals, radio signals. And so the way OSINT works is the first thing, the people that would run an operation, assuming I'm right, there was an operation under Norway, and if you read any more of us, I wrote a story a couple of weeks later about how Norway was working in North Korea with us, even before we declared war on North Korea, began bombing, working and taking American SEALs in who were hitting radar sites in the north, all before the war, all 2004, before the Gulf of Tonkin, if you remember, when the United States falsified a North Vietnamese PT boat attack on one of our destroyers. There were two signals. A guy manning the radar on a destroyer. It was a windy day, and they were running top secret off the record CIA covert ops against North Vietnam, trying to provoke North Vietnam to do something in '64 so Johnson could do what he did, got a provocation and killed him, and bombed away, and then got an authorization from Congress, 2 senators, Morris and Gruning, saying no, and nobody in the House saying no, giving them authority to put what came to 500,000 people, and kill what, 2 or 3 million, we usually say, Vietnamese, as if there's no distinction, and 58,000 of our guys, plus who knows how many. I deal with a lot of vets, Vietnam vets, and boy, that's a war. By 06, 05 and 06, if you watch the footage of the war, the guys were pretty straight. I was in the Army, you had to be straight. You couldn't, you had to be squared away. As I was a grunt with a rifle, infantryman, and this is in 61, 62. By 67, 68, nobody's shaved, nobody's hair is long, nobody's wearing the right thing, no helmets, they're walking around. You can just see it. They knew this was just a question of living and getting through it. There's so much to say about all that because we did stupid things then. And I think I'm worried that we're going to start and do something else. I don't know what happens if it goes bad for the Ukrainians and you have all this manpower. They're exercising. The 82nd even rotated troops back already. They've been there so long. 101st is there. A lot of weapons and arms are coming. I'm told the game's going to be, this is NATO. We're supporting NATO in offensive operations against the Russians, which isn't going to fool the world or fool much of us, I hope. It's us fighting Russia. And why we want to do that, I don't think many of our generals have read history. The last 3 or 4 days of Stalingrad, the death and kill rate was 2,400 for the Russians every 4 hours. And they didn't lose that battle. I mean, come on. We really want to mix it up with those guys? I don't think so. We have an army that hasn't fought anywhere. I did a documentary years ago about Grenada. That was a laugh riot. It's always a laugh riot when it seems like we're not prepared, but I don't know. Anyway, so I'm in a war with Biden, and I'll tell you what I wish the press would do at one of these news conferences. I wish the press would say, hey guys, 4 days after the September the 26th last year, after the bombing, after the mines, they were mines, the mines went off, and 3 of the 4 pipelines were destroyed. 4 days later, there were Jake Sullivan, who was Hillary's guy on email too, and then worked for Strobe Talbot when Strobe was at Brookings, and Strobe was the guy that convinced Clinton rather, more than anybody else to start adding more countries to NATO, squeeze the Russians. He was a big player in squeezing the Russians. Perfectly nice guy. I mean, I liked him, but his policy was just crazy. Anyway, the question to ask, 4 days afterwards, Jake Sullivan had a news conference, and it took 11 minutes before one of the reporters asked him about the pipelines that had been blown up. And he said, well, the Swedes and the Danes are doing a study of it. Well, let's see the fallout on that. And I think that was the 30th. And I think around the 16th or the 18th of the next month, November, they came out with a report that showed, damn it, there was an explosion, and it was probably sabotage. That was their report. So here's the question asked the White House, if you want to be barred from getting any briefings or any access anymore. This is the question to ask. So, Ms. Press Secretary, or if you ever get Sullivan or Blinken or Newland in your crosshairs, say, so the president has the right to task, that's a formal word, the intelligence community to do an investigation. He can do it, the Office of ONI, its director is this woman, Miss Haynes, who just gave a speech about how we're going to have to go to war with China to show them who's top dog. I mean, just down the line White House stuff. So I don't know how far you would go with the ONI. She's the head of intelligence there, the chief intelligence officer. Her testimony was really scary, all about China. And, you know, I don't know, half the clothes we're wearing now are probably made in China, not longer. But anyway, nothing good's going to come out of what we're doing in China. Just nothing. It's nothing, you know, good. Help somebody else with. Anyway, the question is, he could have asked them if he didn't think that was going to be very good. The CIA has a great directorate of intelligence. Some of you know, they have an operations division. They have, you know, a technical division, scientific divisions there, and the intelligence. There's a lot of very bright people there, and could have asked the intelligence to give a study. And if you're in the field, like some people were in Norway, there's a special group that deal with special operations, that a special intelligence group. It used to be called the C group, but they probably changed the name all the time. They're the guys that if you're in the field somewhere, they're monitoring everything around you, all the local phone calls to see if anybody's suspicious about what's going on. They're really the hot shit guys in terms of protecting. The job is to protect people in the field. And if they see neighbors or people, you know, they're meeting, you know, and they're meeting in somewhere near Oslo, even though it's an inconvenient place. People live there and they see people coming and go. Who knows, you could get suspicious, although Norwegians don't seem to be very curious. We probably put close to $1 billion worth of electronic and military equipment there in the last year. They go 1,400 miles from Oslo all the way to the Arctic Circle where they meet Russia. And we have a brand new synthetic aperture radar we've put there, which is very expensive. You can't, and it's monitoring a big Soviet missile base on the other side of the mountains in the Kola Peninsula. And we fly missions over there. We've trained we've given the Norwegians some of our best patrol planes out of Boeing. Have sold 5 of them. Anyway, so ask them. Why doesn't he want to ask them? Why doesn't anybody ask if he's done a report? Well, he hasn't done a report. He hasn't tasked them for anything because he knows the answer. I mean, I don't know what's in the water here in this town, but he did it. He did it. I'm telling you, he did it. And I'm not taking a flyer on this. I spent a lot of time on this. He did it. And did he know all the facts that were needed? Does he read the President's Daily Brief, PDP? I don't think many people think he do not. He does not. And he's not the only president to. When Powell was national security advisor to Reagan, they couldn't get Reagan. It's only a 3-page paper. And Bill Casey was head of the CIA then. He used to, on the 3 pages, if there were 1 or 2 things that were important, he'd mark them in yellow and turn them over for the White House, for the president's copy. And he wasn't reading that. So Powell, he is dead, yes. He would kill me if I wrote this. He used to go and read it to a tape recording and then play the tape for the guy. And he'd watch that. That's how you got the president to see the PDP. I mean, that's at least for some time. No, don't shake your head. I'm not saying it happened all the time, because Reagan had his moments too of lucidity, a lot of them, but not at the end. All right, there we go. So I'll answer questions. This is, you know, my, I'll answer, I won't talk about sourcing because, you know, so I was at a restaurant yesterday and somebody came up and said, who's the source? You know, that's not going to happen. So go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. Just speak.
Carl Sullivan, there was one pipeline that was not destroyed. Presumably the demolition charges still, there presumably are demolition charges from the one pipeline that was not destroyed. Would not those obviously lead back to the perpetrators?
If we went and did it, if we went and got the C4 or whatever it was?
Whoever may have them.
Here's the problem.
So secondarily, just briefly, so you may answer both questions.
But let me just answer the first
Yes,
one
sir.
first. You always plan for everything. And for example, about OSINT, they put out they could have, if they wanted to, the people running this, to take care of the OSINT people, they could have had the Japanese fleet in 1941 coming down to bomb Pearl Harbor. They could have done anything they wanted. They could have painted any scene for the people that monitor it, which is, it's hard for people in OSINT to accept that, but they're part of the cover. And so they would have thought if you remember the story I wrote, it was supposed to happen in June. He said no, he bailed out. He was afraid he'd be named then. And they had 3 more months. And the problem they worried about was, you know, it's low frequency. As you know, high frequency in water burns out. Low frequency is really like this. Like when kids, remember, knock, 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 knock. That's what it is. And there's always a chance, there's so much traffic and so much low frequency noise of popping it. And also there was a worry about just being there that long, you know, and still being viable. I don't know what happened with one of it, but I assure you the people involved thought of every option, which in other words, there was nothing there that would be traceable. It was all standard stuff. They used, the sonar devices they used were off the shelf, made by Raytheon. The one they dropped in the trigger, it was all off the shelf. They had to know what you're doing. And the miners involved, I'll tell you how many there were, 2. And it's from the mine command, and the mining command in the Navy is not a high-end command, but those guys are amazing. They're assigned to almost every task force around the world. They, as I wrote, they do good things. They clear harbors. They get rid of damage, you know, where the bombs took place was off an island in World War II that the Nazis controlled. And there was tremendous stuff on the bottom all over. That's one question. So I haven't asked anybody specifically a question, but I know they had a list of all the things that could go wrong. So, and that would be it, leaving stuff there that would be traceable.
And this is very briefly a follow-up to a question I asked you at your last Committee for the Republic event. I was a secondary 9/11 responder as U.S. Customs agent, specifically sifting the rubble of World Trade Center 7, an anomaly which refutes the official narrative of 9/11. Tucker Carlson just appeared on the show Redacted, and he spoke about World Trade Center 7 and asked, why is it we can't talk about the way that building came down, that it doesn't fit any official narrative? And I would ask you to please follow up on that. Thank you.
Well, half the mail I get is about 9/11 again, and the other half is about the JFK assassination. So, you know, it's just, I mean, I don't know, where do you begin? So Building 7 is a big hot wire for a lot of people. I can't, you know, I'm happy with my little conspiracy now that I'm into. What do you really want to get? I just...
I have a text for you, author Lawrence Guido, The Unspoken Kennedy Truth, which...
There you go. I'll take it. I promise I'll read it. It's given to me. I promise I'll read it. I'll read all that stuff. I will tell you.
Thank you.
No problem. I will tell you that this is, you or he?
Yes, sir.
I will tell you that there is stuff, I'm going to write about something. There is stuff that has not been released by the Warren Commission. And it's really scary what they did, some of the stuff they withheld. It's a great story. I'm not ready to write it yet. I'm too busy with this other one. I'm going to stick with this one. I'm going to stick with this one because the Biden game is to wait it out and never say yes. I not only because there's down the road incredible, I did a lot of reading about law of the sea, and there is no statute now that specifically deals with destruction of a pipeline. There's a lot of statutes going back to 1884, and there was a treaty we signed that was augmented in 1898. We signed it about if you inadvertently or overtly cut a telegraph line. And then there's a lot of stuff that was done after we started putting coaxial cables and all the stuff we do, all the communications we now have. There's law about that. And there's a movement among some committee in a bar association committee to get some law written that's accepted on actually destroying a pipeline. But there's certainly an awful lot of law about responsibility for breaking something. So I think that's one issue, but you've got enough. You can grab me later.
Bless you, thank you.
No, don't bless me. Are you kidding? I'll take it. I want more than blessing. I want police protection. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. And I wanted to say I read The Dark Side of Camelot as soon as it came out, and I'd love to know what happened to that closet full of suitcases of cash JFK collected from the ambassador to Ireland that spoke to you. But my question, more au courant, is this. Talking to several people from Germany and in German politics and journalism, they've always been suspect of Chancellor Scholz,
Right.
who has not even finished half his mandate at this point. He's pretty close. How much did Scholz know
Well,
about the destruction, and did people within his cabinet, were they given a heads up on it all?
but this is not a first, first time I've been asked that question. Um, there was a news here's one of the things that makes the White House's, the press corps' acquiescence on this, but you ought to read transcripts of the White House press corps. They always start off with jolly stuff about, the one I read, when Schultz was here, it was an amazing dog. He was here just the other week, as you know. It was an amazing dog and pony show. He flew in on a Thursday, I think, with no press corps. He's a chancellor, with no German press corps with him, which is really interesting. I don't know what he does Thursday. Friday, I would gather he had a meeting, but the first official, no dinner for him. We're talking about the Chancellor of Germany, no dinner for him. And on Saturday, they had a little thing with he and the president sat down before the press corps. They were invited in, and they both, from reading from notes, praised each other and, vowed like it was in the 15th century in England, loyalty to the crown, being Biden. And there was a lot of talk about that. And then when it was over, the press started yelling, and the press secretary, you could hear her. The only way I found this was on C-SPAN. Go watch C-SPAN. Remember, people forget it just goes and goes. And so after it was over, the reporters are trying to talk, and the press secretary is screaming at him, no, he said, no, no questions, no, and they're shoving him out, and Biden's watching it. Eventually he starts laughing. He enjoys it, which is okay. I don't blame him. It's very easy not to like the press corps, but not when you don't ask them about, what you're talking about is, let's make an assumption. Let's make an assumption you're a bunch of guys in the community that know how to do things. And you really know how to do things, and you're competent, and you don't make noise. You got a new CIA director, Burns, who probably took the job because, CIA director, last time he was around, he was so bored, he was running one of the big foundations. Which one was it? Carnegie, I think, right? And he was running Carnegie. He must have been so bored going to cocktail parties. When he was a deputy secretary of state, he was a very a very pleasant man. And then he went to Russia, and as you know, in his memoir, he said, do not expand NATO to the east, or you'll end up with a war. And we still keep on writing that Biden attacked without provocation. Plenty of provocation, not enough to justify what he did. You can't cross that line. He started a war. But having said, there was a lot of provocation, and we did park missiles a couple of clicks away from the border in Poland that we called defensive, that everybody in the business knows overnight could be turned and could turn, just a couple of those bombs could turn Moscow into a pit that had that much power. So that we pushed the button on him pretty hard, but still okay. So in the process of trying to stop him, the White House, I wrote about this in that first story, they had a meeting. They convened, Jake Sullivan, a meeting of some of the wise people from the CIA, NSA, State Department, Treasury, JCS. And of course, and I actually deliberately used word of art language. The question was, we want options for the president to convince Putin not to do it. And the question actually was raised, was the question that the group came back with, do you want stuff that's reversible or irreversible? I thought about using that language, and I decided, hell, they might as well know. And I also described where the meeting was. It was across the street from the White House in the EOB in a very special place. And so I didn't quite give the room number, but so I just wanted them to know I did know something, and they do read that stuff, they know. And of course, it turned out they wanted stuff that was irreversible. Sanctions, who needs sanctions? Ask the Cubans about sanctions. Ask Russia about sanctions, there was all this bragging in the days afterwards that the ruble's down to 1 cent. He's surviving, and he's selling a lot of oil to other places, and not as much a bigger discount initially there was, but he's still turning a pretty penny on his oil. He got a lot of it, got a lot of gas too. And there's been since Kennedy days, there's been an incredible chronic anxiety about Russia using its large volumes of gas and oil as a weaponization, to get main inroads with Germany particularly and Western Europe, where there is no natural gas or oil. They depend on us. We've always had Western Europe's and Germany's, even Germany, don't forget, Willy Brandt came up with the great notion of Ostpolitik, which was simply a way of saying to the people in Europe that his soldiers had been murdering, raping, and mutilating and destroying for 10, 12 years, that I'm going to be your buddy. I'm going to be a big trading partner. Ostpolitik's we're going to be a fortress using Russian gas, cheap Russian. We're going to build up our economy. We're going to be great trading partners. We want in. Of course, it took the French a long time, but they did get in NATO. And then East Germany got into NATO with the commitment that we wouldn't expand NATO, but we know all that. So anyway, to get to your question. So the group that finally got together, the mission was come up with something that could maybe make Putin back off. And by this time, we're talking about the end of 2011. And he's already putting forces up. And by early 2012, I'm told that we saw the first signs of some medical vans, which always, vans that return into operating rooms. And that's another big sign. So by January, they were able to say, we think we can do it. We think we can blow the mines. They knew what he wanted. I don't know how they knew. There's something there I don't know, but they quickly came after a lot of back and forth about sanctions and what else. The group finally came to, let's see if we can find a way to blow the mines, blow the pipelines, and put them back in the dark ages, presumably. The goal was to convince Putin that the cost of going in is high. He'd already shut down one of the pipelines, Nord Stream 1, which had been running since 2011, and putting so much gas into Germany that the Germans were retailing some of it downstream, selling it downstream to other providers, and making profits on it that the Russians just didn't bother them with. It was just minor stuff. But there was that much gas. The BASF is the largest chemical company in the world that right now has been talking to China about maybe moving some of their assets there. What he did with the bombing is he told Europe, he told Schultz too, we'd rather you keep on putting money into Ukraine, even though you're getting more and more skeptical. This is even by the fall of last year, more and more skeptical of, at the worst, a standoff, a very expensive standoff. And West Germany and Germany, they weren't as interested in the game as Biden was. I think Biden also saw beating up Russia as a ticket to ride. Historically, Jack Kennedy is a classic example. Presidents always did well in camp politically in wars. And Kennedy used to talk about how Lincoln, the great presidents were Lincoln and FDR Roosevelt because they won the war. So we have all that history behind us. I don't know nobody knows what's in his mind, but I assume he does. And I think this is good politics for him. It's turning. If you ask the right question of Americans now, is $113 billion too much? More than 62% in the last poll I saw said, yes, enough of this money. We've got other things to do with it. And ironically, in the Vietnam War, it was always the Democrats and a few moderate Republicans that were the leaders. Now the critics are reversed. The Democrats are dead on this one. They want this war, and they want to push with China. And we've got more, we do have a considerable body of Republicans who are against it, but they're not the majority. It's a very strange position. As, I always thought the Democratic Party was more anti-war, but they're into this one big time. They all outdo each other in saying terrible things about Russia, some of which are valid. On the other hand, Russia, until this war, was a big trading partner with Western Europe. Economy was booming. Tourism was booming. They were really enjoying it. I went there 4 or 5 years ago to see somebody do some work, but I was struck by the willingness of the businessmen I was talking to. I was just to piss all over Biden. There was no fear of talking about him. Rather, not Biden, but Putin. They were they didn't like Putin at all there, but the country was making money. Everything was going. We had McDonald's. We had a lot of, and people would say America. They liked Americans. They liked our food. They like our stuff, as the world does generally. We go around the world and we talk to people. We want to know, tell me about your mom. And we do that. We have a history of being very open and friendly, which we are by nature, than most of the Europeans. Anyway, so I think. So to get back to your question, so they told the White House by mid-January of last year, we can do it. We think we can do it. They didn't know they could do it, but they know they had, there's a group of divers. I started writing about Panama City in Florida. It's the best diving, probably the best, one of the best diving schools, certainly in America, but in the world. They train really good divers. And the divers always like to say, we're not, the SEALs are swimmers who do a mission, then go on television right away and talk about it and write books about it and fight each other to who's the first to get out with the story. I'm thinking about the killing of bin Laden. And the miners, the divers from Panama City who are trained there just don't talk. 2 were used to set 4 bombs, very small operation. And there was a decompression chamber for them. They didn't have to take a lot. They had to go down 30, every 80, 90 feet and stop. They're breathing what, helium, oxygen, and nitrogen. And they had to go down slowly, but they could pop up fast. There was, in the pickup ship, there was a Norwegian minesweeper. They had enough room to put a recovery chamber so they could pop up. You didn't have to be on station long, and they're not beeping. They're not seen by the OSINT. Anyway, I go through that all the time because it's still a chronic, I hear it every day. So there I am with all this stuff. And so they tell the White House that this is, you have options. And in a meeting with, and Biden in a meeting with Schultz in February, about 3 weeks after getting this information, says if Russia goes, we're going to take out Nord Stream 2, the new one. The second pipeline had been built and had been sank. It was completed by the end of 2021, and it was filled with gas, actually, 750 miles worth of it. It's that long of a pipeline. One straight shot from basically from Leningrad or St. Petersburg all the way down to a corner of, I read maps badly because I was in the Army and learned how to read maps. So that's why I read them badly, I guess. I don't know. I don't know which part of Germany, but it went straight to a dock in Germany. It was sealed. Schultz had sealed it. So in front of Schultz, he says, I know how to stop it. And he's asked by, do you actually know how to do it? He said, I know it and I will do it, he said. I don't know why nobody pays attention to that language. He actually laid out the charge. And I think when the bombs finally were run, when he finally authorized it, I think my guess is a lot of people involved, there weren't that many in the operation, who really thought it was a crazy thing to do. Because at that point, he's telling Europe, I'm worried about you. The war is not going well. It's going to cost a lot of money. Germany's always been hesitant to rearm since World War II, obviously. They don't want to commit as much as he wants. He's putting up more. The money's going up. The pressure's growing because Congress is going to give him a hard time now about the budget, spending all that money in Ukraine. So what he did is he cut off Schultz's opportunity. If he chose, we're talking about September, October, November. It turned out to be a mild winter, but nobody knew that. He's cutting off Schultz's ability to keep his people warm and his businesses prosperous, because there's no question it's getting worse every week. The indicators are the prices of in France right now. A lot of the turbines that produce energy are gas run because natural gas is so cheap. In France now, the price of electricity has gone up 4 and 5 times percent. Natural gas is up 3 to 4 times in Italy. It's hard to get a good reading in Germany because they subsidize 20 to 25% of the gas all last year, all during the winter. But they're running out of money and they don't have the reserves they had last year. So if it's a bad winter, it's going to be a bad winter for Joe. He's going to be in real political trouble. Look, why don't we do more questions? Why am I yapping so much? What time, is it midnight? What time is it?
It's at midnight.
What time is it?
Bill Thomas, you mentioned Jake Sullivan's talking group. One person you quoted said, if we do this, it's an act of war. Is the United States trying to lure Russia into a direct confrontation? And you also mentioned that Biden doesn't seem to know what he's doing from one day to the next when he's talking about this. Who is running the show? Who is running Joe Biden?
My old Jewish immigrant mother would say, Ve'ezmir. Well, who knows? Who knows? I don't know who's running. I do know that his status is such he could talk all the smack he wants to about how safe the banks are, and they're still diving. He's not able. He doesn't have enough standing to even convince. Even though this was a lot of cyber currency stuff that always was suspect. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to follow up on
Well, about who knows, and I said, I don't know what's going on in the White House. Can you speak up though, okay?
Thank you. Why don't the Europeans and then the Germans see this as an act of war against them, because we're deindustrializing Europe, and you mentioned BASF, and BASF having to go to China to, I mean, everything's shut
Well,
down
they're just
there.
talking about it, but they're talking about moving stuff. They can't be, you can't make a plan, an industrial plan, without knowing what your fuel base is going to be and the cost.
But
And
if
so that's
Europe is
impossible right now.
suffering so
Well, there's a
badly,
lot more going on. I've got a million, not a million, I talked to a lot of people in Europe and particularly in Germany, want me to talk and they want me to go there, and I don't talk to politicians.
right,
I
but
just don't.
this is
I
like
make-
an act of war against Europe.
What?
This is like an act of war against NATO.
Well, that's not illogical. The logic's going to be, don't forget, even though I'm told this may be overdrawn, but if it's a hot summer, you need energy to drive the air conditioners. And the French are going to maybe put 2 nuclear sites back on. But I got to tell you, somebody, some phone is on? So just so, because I can't hear over that. And so, the problem with that is we shut down nuclear reactors for a reason. So, and there's a lot of worry about putting them back online, but they're going to do it, put them back online. And they're already scrambling to try and produce some LNG facilities. They haven't yet to do it. But there is some scramble. LNG is more expensive. It's liquefied natural gas, and it's an actual process. And we, as you know, we sold a lot of LNG when after the crisis began to Europe at 2 and 3 times the price, of course. The difference between, we went to war with a guy, the NATO went to war with a guy in Moscow who owns the industrial base of weapons. He can turn a factory on. You know, if you remember the famous story about all the moms and grandmothers who went to work for Ford and turned out a ship a day when Roosevelt, he commandeered, he basically took over the assembly lines of the Ford and all those things. But we can't do that. If we want to build more weapons, we got to go to a weapons company. We got to sign a contract. We got to have all these lawyers work on it, all these, conditions for returning. We don't have the capability. And so all these stories about shortfalls and weapons that were in the paper were just crazy, because he can turn the button on. And I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. I'm spreading gloom, and I don't want to, because there is no upside. As long as you don't have people that listen in the bureaucracy. I mean, you know who Newland's husband is, David Kagan. And there's this study of war, their site that every newspaper cites. It's a very conservative site. It's the least reliable site on what's going on in Ukraine, because it's just not. Yeah. Why am I doing this? Where are you? Okay, you do this.
Si, thank you. I just want to get your comments on this cover story from the intelligence agencies in America and maybe in Germany, that you got 4 guys and a gal, maybe from the Odessa diving club, rent a yacht in Gdansk and then sail out into the most, I guess, surveilled part of the world, undetected. How could, and so the New York Times and the Washington Post print this?
That's what I was reading about earlier.
Yeah, don't print anything about you and your theory?
No,
What's going on?
What's going on is they don't like what I'm writing. And so they're entitled not to like it, and particularly since I work there, and particularly I'm pretty snarky about them. Although a lot of good reporters, what I've said, even when I was at the Times, I saw who got promoted. I came away working 7, 8 years there thinking, if we got rid of 90% of the editors, we'd be in such good shape. Because if you had 2 choices between a guy that's going to yip at you and go at you, and a guy that's going to go along, they always pick the go along guy. I guess that happens in the corporate world too. I don't know. That story, I know more about it than I can say. okay? I know a lot more about it than I can say. I just can't talk about it, but it's a, I sometimes think this president's lost his intelligence community. I mean, they're, you know, why not stick it to him with this crazy story? I mean, I sometimes think that because it's such a bad story. You have to know something. You can't have you can have a Ukrainian passport with a false ID. Try and rent a really 100-foot yacht. You have to be credentialed. You have to have a bank account. You can't come with two names that don't exist on a Ukraine passport. The diver has to be certified. The doctor that's on the board for the diver, there's a special group of divers that are qualified for underwater recovery. I'm serious, there are. You can't just put it, and you have to have a crew that understands what's going on everything wasn't, all of the basics weren't in that story, to the point where if anybody asked anybody a question about it, there was something wrong with the story. And so why did a story so bad get out? I mean, that's what I think about. Yes, well, is it midnight? I want to get out of here. What time is
no.
it? Is it 8:30?
Hey, Si.
What time is it?
You got
Okay, oh my God.
Yeah.
This is,
A wonderful
I didn't want to do
presentation.
this.
Yes,
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, first, you know, George Washington said we need to stay out of Europe because it's just give us entangling alliances and get us in a mess. And John Quincy Adams repeated that we don't go abroad in monsters to destroy. You've described a huge mess in Europe, even though it's not perfect. You think we just aggravate and make it worse. The second is the framers stated when they were debating the Constitution that a president who lied about or concealed information that was important to international affairs, it would be an impeachable offense. According to your narrative, is what President Biden has concealed an impeachable offense. And the last is, I'm surprised there's not a single member of Congress here, because they actually have power over impeachment and power of investigation. You suggested that President Biden could have tasked some unit in the executive branch to go investigate who blew up the gas pipelines. But you've been reporting a long time, and Congress used to have some real oversight. You remember something called Watergate? And actually had stories they ran that were anonymous, like Deep Throat for Woodward and Bernstein. Have any member of Congress contacted you, and why do you think they're so indifferent to the information that you've adduced?
Nothing, I don't want to misrepresent it. I pick up the phone at home and somebody did call me, but I said, I can't talk to you. They certainly tried to contact me, one member. But I'll just give you a scenario. Chuck Schumer, 2 votes plurality in the Senate, takes the floor and says, I demand my Democratic president come up and tell the truth about this. There's enough questions. Just give me that scenario. Just give it to me. It's not there. It's not there. I thought, you know, I once, for reasons having to do with something I was looking at involving banking overseas, there was a very interesting hearing in the House about 5 years ago with a couple of former DEA guys that had they were retired, but they discovered something interesting. And it was Jim Jordan's committee, or he was chairman of a subcommittee. And I went to the hearing, just sat in the back row, and I actually was amazed because Jordan did something most people in Congress didn't do. He actually knew he studied it. And I thought, well, here's a smart guy. And so I wonder what's he doing playing around with Hunter Biden's thing. I can tell you as a reporter, I've had 2 times where once with a major oil, the head of a major oil company whose son was doing something terrible. And I've learned the hard way, don't do that story because fathers will do things for their son. That's all. Let somebody else do it. And so Joe Biden on that, he's got a horrible problem. The kids, you know, it's 650-page document, that book, the Mac. And somebody sent me somebody actually paid to have it printed out, every page, and with annotated, going footnotes for every allegation in it, where the police said this and the crimes were reported. Amazing work done. It must have taken half a year. And I didn't want anything to do with it because fathers and sons, you know, and daughters and mothers and daughters, it's just not a story to go. So I don't know, I know he's very caustic and he's very out there. He's also really smart, unlike the other guys. And I would tell him, if you want to be president, cool off and start getting into the mainstream. But he doesn't want to hear me say that. Yeah, back there.
Oh.
Somebody has, he's got some. I'm not in charge, I'm sorry. No, I'm not in charge. He is.
I'll give it to you after.
No, you
Gareth, I
can't do, why
promise.
don't you guys take it outside?
Okay.
Take it outside, come on. We'll hold your coats. Go ahead.
Yeah, Sam Husseini. People may not, or some people may not be aware that you wrote a rather important book about biological and chemical warfare back in 1968. It may have helped lead to the U.S. eventually signing the Bioweapons Convention in 1972. And you also
Are you
appeared.
my brother-in-law? I want to know.
You keep saying that to me.
Yes.
I asked you to help me find a publisher, and you're like, "What are you, my brother-in-law?"
Yeah, go ahead. What do you want, Sam?
So I want you to weigh in on pandemic origins and gain of function work, and you
No,
were
I'm
also
not
in
here to-
Wormwood,
I'm here.
which has a tie-in to. But you'll talk about a little bit about Building 7, but you won't talk about pandemic origins.
I'm not talking about 7, and I'm not talking about pandemic. I'm here to talk about something else, Sam. I'm just here. It's not fair.
Oh.
It's not fair.
I
That
wasn't
doesn't
trying
mean
to-
I don't have some information, maybe, but not enough to worry about.
Okay, all right.
I'm really-
I mean, I guess a concern that I have is how, the independent and progressive media really sort of blew the story, and it's become owned by the right wing.
No,
Isn't that a
It's
big
not-
problem
no,
there?
It's another question. I can't do this, and I can't. I'm not here
I'll
to
give Gareth,
pour out
the-
everything I know,
no.
Sam. I'm not.
Gareth, you still
Sam,
want?
don't run away just because you don't like my answer. Yeah, Gary.
Si, there's nobody in this country who is better qualified to give us an analysis of how the press in this country has changed over the years, over the decades. And presumably, I presume you think that it's gotten worse, although I'm not sure. But, for sure, we know that it was not doing precisely what it was supposed to be doing, even in the 50s and 60s during the Cold War. And so I'd be interested in your analysis of how it's changed and why, if you can talk about that.
I actually worked the high end. I worked at New York Times and I worked at the New Yorker. And I was a kid. I learned about the war, covering the war in 65 and 66 from the Pentagon. I learned about how bad the war was. But, Gary, that's a hell of a question. We all can see how it's changed. I did Substack because Matt Taibbi told me about it. I'm innocent about stuff. And the response I had to that first story that was just thrown out was like 1 million hits in 20 hours. And so the New York Times now, when I joined the New York Times, it had a circulation of 1.7 million a day. And you couldn't get an ad in there. It was so crowded. You had to wait for display ads, mostly on a lot of display for how the world's changed. And now its circulation it's 320 or 330 print, and they just can't wait to get people like me going. They don't like us anymore. They want it all go online, and it's become a moneymaker because it has it does podcasts, it does a sports thing, it buys all this stuff. So it's not really, it's sort of like an entertainment. They still have very good reporters. I hate the coverage of the White House, I always have, because it's, when I was at the Times, I was a little star boy, and I delivered a lot, I was doing Vietnam, and they signed me to Watergate because Woodward and Bernstein were killing the Times. And so I did a lot of work on it. And my reward was, in late 73, I was told you could have the best job in America, the White House correspondent for the New York Times, because that leads to a column and then to be executive editor or something like that, a poobah in the business. So I went there, and Ron Ziegler was the press secretary, and I was there the first day. All the reporters did was yell at him. And the second day, and I said, what is this? And the second day, that's all he did was yell at him. And I told the editor, I can't do this. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm not doing this. I demand to be, put me on any desk you want, or do something you want. And he said, you do not leave that job. I said, I quit. He said, okay, you can do what you want. So I went back, but I was going to quit. So I have a horror about the White House press corps. I think they're so tied to the beat. I think the whole problem with the beat business is awful because you're tied to who you're reporting to. And you have to read some of the transcripts of the daily briefings now, where they're getting nothing but pablum as they go. I'm not questioning the new, she's competent, she's perfectly competent, they're all competent. But their job is to produce pablum and reduce everything to pablum. And that's not challenged by anybody. After that meeting with that unbelievably shoddy, embarrassing meeting with Schultz, who went home, slunk his way back. I hope they put him at least in the Blair House and, not in a Motel 6 somewhere. But, it was really unbelievable. It was so depressing to see this man coming like a lapdog and having 5 minutes in the sun. And then they put him on with, it doesn't matter, with somebody who wasn't, they knew would not ask a tough question. He did have an interview with somebody and he was gone. And none of the reporters, when they got back after being kicked out, I read the transcript. There's a transcript you can find. Yeah, it is. It's not a transcript. You can pick up the conversation. There's a place to get the daily briefing. It began with a lot of jokes about everybody in the first row was a woman. They went back and forth to that instead of coming out and saying, how dare you not talk to the chancellor? He was there when the president said, 9 months ago, a year ago, and nobody's even asked a question about the president, what the president said. And when Jake, whatever his name is, Sullivan, that little conference I mentioned 4 days after the bombing where he said, let the Norwegian Denmark do it, nobody asked about what the president had said. We can do it and I will do it, he said. Nobody asked about it. And I guess that's because you lose points if you do. And that's where we're at with coverage right now. It wasn't that way. I don't know. I know somebody very famous who was teaching at MIT in 1960 when Kennedy won the election, inauguration day, and here come the boys from Harvard, McGeorge Bundy and the whole gaggle. And when it was all over and Kennedy was declared president, this person who's a very liberal person, and now the terror begins, he said. You've got the smart boys from Harvard there in the business, and look what'll happen. Didn't take long. He went with his feel-good doctor, giving him a shot before he went to he went to the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, and he tried to talk the dialectic with Khrushchev and got smashed. He didn't know what he was talking about because he got in a 5-minute course while he was high on a drug. I'm telling you, and the press doesn't write all. I wrote about that stuff, and boy, did I catch hell for it. He took that doctor on. The doctor was on the manifold of the White House one. The doctor that was shooting up everybody in New York with feel-good stuff. What was it? It was just the drugs that you get. Not steroids. You get stimulated by. What's the category of the drugs? What is it? Oh, yeah, amphetamines. You got it. Amphetamines. Are we done? Aren't we? Don't we?
I have a question
Don't
here.
you guys have a life?
With,
Go back. Yeah.
no, I've got the mic, please.
Yes, go.
A question with regard to Ukraine. The Ukrainian war is tremendously draining on Russia, not only in terms of manpower being lost, but material.
Well, they're down 45 billion in their economy. Yes.
Right. So how much longer can they keep that up?
Are you kidding? Ask the Germans who were in the last week in Stalingrad. He hasn't put the big boys in. He's still got the Wagner group going on one side. On the other side, he has a bunch of reservists, really. I mean, he weaned out those guys who are doctors and lawyers, but he's got a lot of reservists with minimal training on the other side. He has not he's got 350,000 in reserve.
But how much longer can he keep going at this level and maintain sufficient support within Russia, particularly among the oligarchs?
You're missing the boat. The problem isn't the oligarchs, it's the right wing. That's the real problem.
In Russia.
Every reporter's missing something. The real problem are the rightists.
Okay, so
now,
what
listen
happened?
to me.
How is this going to play out?
Passing over something I'm telling you that's very important.
All right, fine. But
There's
how's
a
it
lot
gonna
of fear of, a lot of people keep their mouth shut about it because it's the rightists that want to keep going. So there's a lot of prominent people that want to say more, but there's a big right movement. He's got a problem with the rightists in Russia, the extreme rightists.
So how might that play out then?
Not, presumably, not well.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Hirsch. Kelly Vlahos with Responsible Statecraft at the Quincy Institute. I'm an early subscriber to your new Substack, and thank you so much for it.
I know you. You don't think I read you?
Well, thank you very much.
You've got that. You know, what's his name? The West Pointer. What's his name?
Andy Basovich.
Andy Basovich is the only person I've ever read from that war that has described in print the daytime bombing we did of Germany as one of the great war crimes of the year, of history. We were bombing civilians, and we all know from the bombing survey that with each daytime raid, resistance to a surrender grew. The support for the war, support for the Hitler regime went up the more and more we bombed civilians. And so he actually wrote it in an article in a Veritas, wonderful magazine, about 5 or 6 years ago. And I said to myself, wow, that's seeing. My wife's uncle was the darling of the family because he was a beautiful young man at 19. He went and did 44 missions, B-17s flying north of, from the, I want to say the Midlands, but that was too far up, of a base north of London, in which he learned. I got him really drunk one night, and he wouldn't talk about it. All those guys. My father-in-law was in South Pacific for 4 years on a destroyer or a cruiser, on a battleship. And once, years later, I asked him, so what did you do in the war? And he looked at me and he said, sorted mail. So you have that attitude. And for Andy, go ahead. What's your question? That's you. You don't need my soliloquy.
Sorry. Andy is the best, so I totally agree. I have a quick question. Can we expect any follow-up to your Nord Stream sabotage story, whether it be
From me?
From you?
No.
Not at all.
No.
You seem to hint that in your
No,
Substack.
I wrote today about just what came up earlier. I wrote today about the visceral response America has to Russian gas and oil. And it's very interesting. You could find some interesting history about it. And somebody said to me, one of my friends, it could be a PDP, he said, was a great compliment, President's Daily Brief, which I'm sure nobody in the White House reads anymore. They sort of know it. They don't pay attention to it. But no, because I said casually, but I meant it. I've never put anybody in jail. I've never done any damage. And in that story, the reason there was such a strange construct, if you read it carefully, I have nobody ever in a meeting talking to me. Because if it's, as I'm saying here, it's a small group. Nobody in a meeting talking to me, which means I have to say somebody who knows, whatever construct I use. I worked for years at the New Yorker, and during Cheney-Bush, I was obviously writing a lot of stuff from inside Bush's office. That drove a lot of people crazy. And I had a great time with both the ambassadors to France, Germany, and the Brits, because they weren't getting in. So we used to meet once every 2 weeks with the ambassadors. And I used to get up sometimes to a cold room because I was telling them stuff they couldn't report because Cheney wouldn't have anybody see any of the ambassadors or talk to them. So at that point, I will tell you that I learned a lot about how they watch and what could be said and what couldn't be said. And so I just can't, and I actually, I was very resistant to coming, you know that, but I said I would. You caught me at a gas station a month ago when I had 350 emails an hour. And I said, I'll do what you want, but in another month. And it turned out I learned Friday, this was it, Tuesday. I yelled at him about it, but he won because I said I would. So it's just down to protecting people. And you have to do, that's the priority, even if it means I can't tell everything I know. Like somebody asked me about that crazy story that showed up with the yacht.
Right.
And, if you ask me if I still think he had some of the people in the business with him, I'd say no. I think he's lost some of the people. That's a big loss. But I don't know that. I just sense he's lost some of it. There was, if you read that story carefully, there were a couple of people that said this is a war crime. And the last line said, it was a great thing. We did it beautifully. The only flaw was the idea of doing the mission. He said that was a quote, but that's a blind quote. He's not in a meeting, or she. not in a meeting. And so, but that was the attitude, that does he not know what he's going to do to Western Europe? We've always had Western Europe's back. The one thing we did, look at the terrible stuff we did in Italy, supporting the mafia and the Christian Democrats, you know, and so the Christian, over the Fanfanis, and look what we did in Greece. The worst thing in Greece, the political group that supported the Nazis, we supported because they were anti-communists. I mean, it's just amazing what we did. But in Western Europe, we had the touch of gold. They all became strong economies, strong enough, successful enough that they could let hated Germany in. I mean, can you imagine what the French thought about Germany? And you know how dumb we all are. And you go back to history, and when Mao was running around in the Geneva Convention of I've done a lot of work on this. I'm going to use it for one reason or another, but here I'll just tell you. There was a 1954 Geneva Convention that everybody writes off as a waste of time. But in the convention, it turned out that a very powerful American, not known to anybody, somebody had a good war, a lot of CIA credentials, made a trip there and convinced the Chinese to convince Ho Chi Minh, who just driven the French out of Bien Bien Phu. They just marched the French out of North Vietnam not to go south, because the Chinese never wanted us there. At the same time, the Brits, who are with us theoretically, were already trading with China. So you can answer, the last thing China wanted was us there on that peninsula. And I'll tell you something else about containment that always amuses me. Saigon fell in 75. What was it, May, June? When was it? I don't remember. I should remember. Gary, you remember. Late May? Late April? And so May, early. I know it was that time. So take a look what happened in Cambodia within a few weeks. The Khmer Rouge turned around. Cambodia fell to the Khmer Rouge, and Pathet Lao took over in Vientiane. So within a month, the whole notion of containing China and North Vietnam and whatever, the end of the world in South Asia, we had to fight that fight. That's what the chief said all the time, and Johnson. And every president said that. We had the three countries that we were looking at in Southeast Asia all fell. And then the question, somebody very smart said to me, and what happened? Long pause. Nothing. And now the biggest trading partner China has is with us. Vietnam has with us. What happened? Is it maybe that containment may have been a wrong path to take, as much as Stalin was a creep, which he was, and very paranoid, which he was? I don't know. It's just interesting to look at stuff differently. So I don't know where we are in history now. And I'm afraid that we're starting fights that we won't be able to finish.
Si, there's one more question here. This lady has been.
No, absolutely, let's go.
You take it.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
Hi, Esther Rivera from On the Ground on Pacifica Radio. In all of your research and reporting and talking to people, did any of the people who were in on the planning of this ever consider the environmental impact, the environmental devastation from this act? And, or if you want to give any of your own thoughts on that.
With all due respect, I wasn't, sharing beers with guys and kicking it around. I was on one issue only. I don't think the environmental impact, I don't think there was a side study about the environmental impact. I don't think so. I just don't. I don't mean necessarily this weren't. And you're asking, the impact was enormous, of all that gas bubbling up. Do you remember Danny Schechter from what was he? What was the name of the WBAI? Danny Schechter was on Pacifica a long time ago. So must be, I'm thinking about, when would it be? I'm driving back with my wife and two kids, I'm crossing a bridge going to New York. We were in Cape Cod. I'm driving back to New York, I guess. Was I working in New York? It would have been early in the Vietnam War, maybe in the 66, 65, 64. And I like Danny Schechter, and his news for that day, I knew what time it came on in the morning, and on WBAI in WBAI in New York, right? And so Danny Schechter started off doing some stuff. And now for the news of the day from South Asia, South Vietnam, the war. American troops continued to rape, mutilate, and kill today. And then he went on to the next subject. It was the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. I always think about it. Pretty good way to say it. You know, I'm out of here.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you, Si.
I got this. So.
Great job. No, I don't go down. I'm just too tired. Hello. I wanted you to ask me a question.
I did ask you a question.